Ticket check, please go by the box office and pick them up sometime today or in the next couple days. In that vein, we probably need to say thank you to those that do all of the setup and tear down in this arena for chapel, for games. They work incredibly hard. So for those that work in sound and chair flippers or whatever you call yourself that set up the stages and all that business, thank you. I know you have to work incredibly hard to accommodate everything that goes on in here, and we just want you to know that we appreciate you. So today there'll be guys on the court shooting about 2 p.m., so they got a fast turnaround here ahead of them here in just the next few minutes, so you need to appreciate what those folks do behind the scenes. Couple announcements real quick before I introduce our speaker. For those of you that are interested in student leadership opportunities, whether an RA, Life Leader, ASGCU CAB, whatever it is, tomorrow night right after the gathering, there will be a meeting for you to come and ask questions, get more information about those opportunities for you next fall. The application is going to be out here very shortly. Second semester will be busy doing interviews and posting those who have been selected for those positions. So if you want more information about that, tomorrow night, right after the gathering. So next week, if you don't know this yet, is fall break. So that means, that's right, yeah. So there will be no chapel next Monday. Following that, we'll have only 2 more chapels left before the end of the year. Our next speaker will be Chris Brown. So some of you are wondering, is it that Chris Brown? Well, it's not that Chris Brown. It's a better Chris Brown than that Chris Brown. So you won't want to miss him. That's in 2 weeks. He'll be here speaking in chapel. The last chapel of the year is our annual Christmas service. It's a wonderful time for us to hear a lot of great Christmas music. How many are already listening to Christmas music? Oh, my word. Unbelievable. 95.1. Have you found that yet? Yeah, all you Christmas music aficionados. Anyway, all right, I better move on. Today, our speaker is Beth Guckenberger. Beth and I met about 8 years ago. Beth came to the NASCAR track and spoke in a chapel, and I thought after hearing her speak, anywhere I go, I would love to have her come and share in God's ministry to people that I get to serve with. And so you're in for a treat today. Beth and her husband have been married for 20 years. 17 of those 20 years, they've lived in Mexico. They're raising 10 children, and they recently moved back to the States, getting adjusted to America. So would you welcome Beth today to the stage?
Good morning. Gosh, I have a lot to say. I'm excited, first of all, to be here. Thank you for having me here. This is my first time in Phoenix. It's lovely here, and I appreciate you letting me be here. My story starts a long time ago, but the story that I'm going to share with you started in the summer of 1996. My husband and I had just graduated from Indiana University, and we were taking a bunch of high school students on a mission trip to a town called Querétaro, Mexico. And we were painting this wall around a church we were partnering with, from blue to green, and I was pretty sure the year before we painted it from green to blue. And I knew that the high school students we brought with us weren't feeling very inspired. I wasn't feeling very inspired. It was not exactly what you think of when you think about going and joining what God's doing somewhere around the world. And so complaining about my paint project, my husband got tired of it. And don't miss this detail. We left our students in the hands of very responsible adults, but then we jumped into a taxi cab. And I didn't speak any Spanish at the time, so I just started to say things with a lot of O's and a little Spanish accent on it. And we had been to Albania a couple years before then as college students and had visited an orphanage, and it had stirred something in us. So I just started to say to the taxi guy, El Orfano, El Orfanorio, Orfanatorio, Orfanajorio, Orfanorio. I mean, like, does any of this make any sense to you? And he did understand what it is that we meant, and he drove us to an orphanage, dropped us off. That's what taxi drivers do. I look over at my husband, I'm like, do you even remember the name of the street that church was on? And do we have enough pesos to pay somebody to get us back? And what in the world are we going to say to these people when they answer the door? But when we did get face-to-face in front of the director of that orphanage, we told him we had 3 things. We had about $200 US, We had 20 able-bodied high school students in one complete day, and if he had access to those resources, what would he do with them? And I can tell you all these years later, that's how every single day starts. We wake up wherever it is that our organization is serving around the world, and we try to figure out what it is that we have in our hand. People, time, gifting, resources, materials. What do we have in our hand? Who is it that we're trying to reach out to, and how do we bridge those two in the name of Jesus? And these people told us that their front windows were broken and the kids hadn't had meat in over a year. That next day we came back and served some meat to the kids and fixed the windows, and I found at the end of the day, I followed this little 4-year-old that was so cute. She'd been up in my grill about 4 or 5 times, and my husband's like, I don't really know if 5-year-old can eat 5 hamburgers. Why don't you go find out where these kids are going with all this food? And we followed them to their dorm room, and there I saw in the doorframe of this dorm room all these little preschoolers that were lifting up their mattresses, and they were sticking these burgers underneath them, saving them for another day. And we had in that conversation, in that moment, what I've since called our defining moment. We didn't know it was our defining moment at the time. They don't come up in neon lights the way it would be awesome if there was some sign that said, your whole life is about to change. But we came back to our hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio, and we were in this little time period where we had double income and no kids, which 10 kids later feels like a long time ago. But we put one of our salaries directly into a bank account, and we lived off the other one. And we just thought we would try to position ourselves so that if God asked us to do something about the stirring that we had in our heart when we saw these orphans in another country hiding the meat under their mattresses, we would be postured to do that. So for a whole year, we just lived off one of our salaries. At the end of that year, we thought we were sitting on a treasure. It was 1 year of a teaching salary, so it wasn't that big of a treasure, but it felt like a treasure. And I went to my local branch bank, and I just said to the bank manager, I'm going to move to Mexico. I need to take all my money here and move it to Mexico, but I don't have citizenship, and I'm not a resident, and I actually don't know a single thing about international wire transfer, and we don't even know the names of the banks there. So how would you recommend I best transport all this money? And they taught me about what a traveler's check was. So I turned all that year's salary into traveler's checks that we then drove 3 days from Cincinnati, Ohio, down to the city where we moved, Monterrey, Mexico, and there I thought we'll live off this for at least a year, right? I mean, Mexico's got to not be that expensive to live in. This will keep us for a while. And our heart was to learn the language, learn the culture of the hurt child, and obey God. That was our whole objective. A couple days into being there, the cash we had run out, and it was time to go to a bank and turn these traveler's checks into currency. So we went to this local branch bank, and this lady was behind a window, and she said to me through this little box, Tienes que firmar tu nombre aquí, por favor, ponme el nombre en la línea. Which, I had no idea what that meant, right? So I pushed all our whole life savings under this little divot in the glass, and she just said what she said slower and louder. Firma tu nombre aquí, ponle el nombre en la línea, ponle el nombre aquí. And she gives it all back to me, and I thought maybe she asked for my passport, so I put my passport on top and gave it back to her. It was not what she wanted. She shoved it back to me. We go back and forth, and I'm on the brink of tears, and these people behind me are laughing. I'm like, oh, Jesus, what does she want? Finally, she just said, ponte el nombre en la línea, ponle el nombre, la nombre. And I thought, oh my gosh, I think I've heard that word before this week. Hold on. So I asked my husband for a piece of paper, and I'm like, here, can I have a piece of paper? And then I said, I think I hear her say something. And I wrote the word nombre, and I showed it through the glass. And she's like, uh-huh. And then she points to the line on the checks. So I picked up my pen, and I signed every one of those checks with the word nombre, nombre. One of my favorite verses is Zechariah chapter 4, verse 10. It says this, do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. Jesus did not look down at me that day and think, I sent the wrong girl. She has no idea what to do. She didn't even know how to do a traveler's check. He looked down and looked at my life in that day and recognized the events he had kicked off a year before and how those stories had led to this one. Then he looked ahead to me here 17, 18 years later to this very year we transferred millions of dollars in rupee and naira and pesos around the world to benefit orphans and those that love them. He saw all that was yet to come, and I'm telling you, he's looking at me today going, there are still a whole bunch of things you have no idea how to do. And I have more stories for you. So stay obedient. Have the same goals. Love Jesus. Raise your hand as often as possible. Say yes. Do not despise these small beginnings. I got more storylines and more things I'm going to teach you for the years to come. A couple years ago, I had the chance to study in Israel, and when I was there, I was standing on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. And We were reading the passage in Mark chapter 4 where Jesus tells his disciples, they're in a town called Capernaum, right on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. Hey, we're going to cross over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee and go up to what they called the other side, a town called the Decapolis. And the disciples, I learned while I was there, maybe didn't want to go over to the Decapolis. One, because those folks, they were worshiping the gods of fertility and wine. So you can imagine what their chapel services were like, right? And Jews in the first century, they considered large bodies of water metaphorical for the abyss. It's what the Egyptians got swallowed up in when they chased up after those Israelites. It's where Jonah went when he didn't obey. So maybe those disciples were thinking, I don't want to go over on the other side. I don't want to go over there. We don't know that from Scripture, but we could make some assumptions based on what they knew was there. But when Jesus asks you to do something, you have two choices always. You say yes or you say no. And they said yes, and they got into a boat, and they got halfway across that Sea of Galilee, halfway across that abyss, on the way to obey what God's call was for their life. And the abyss did to them exactly what the abyss does to us. Every time we tell Jesus yes, it kicked itself up in their face. And it came in the form of a storm, a physical storm, tried to stop them from this calling. But I bet if I circled us all up and I said, tell me what Jesus has asked you to do, and what has the abyss done in response to? How has that work been opposed? Where have you felt the storm come into your life when you raised your hand and said, yes, pick me? He's been doing the same thing since the beginning of time. Well, Jesus, setting himself up perfectly for what he was about to go do in the Decapolis, silenced the storm with the words out of his mouth, gets over to the other side. In Mark 5, chapter 5, verse 1, it says Jesus gets out of the boat. Never tells us the disciples get out of the boat. They were maybe all worn out from their abyss crossing. Jesus is met immediately by a man named Legion. He was named Legion because he had so many demons. He had a legion of demons that had possessed him. And Jesus knew as soon as he saw him what was going on. He looks over to his left, and there were 2,000 pigs that were herding there on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. We now know, archaeologists tell us, that the folks who were worshiping the gods of fertility and wine were sacrificing pigs on those altars. They've since found thousands of pig bones there, which is why they were all there. So Jesus cast those pigs into those demons, into those pigs. Those pigs went flying off that cliff into the Sea of Galilee. And I do, for a minute, kind of like the mental picture of the disciples, maybe too afraid to get out of the boat, just waiting for Jesus to finish what he came over there to do. And then all of a sudden, 2,000 demon-possessed pigs come flying over their head. Like, next time, just get out of the boat, right? But then Legion, he looks at Jesus and he says to him exactly what we would imagine him saying. Like, he's freed. This man had been chained up in a graveyard right around town. He still had blood going through his body and air in his lungs. But whomever it was that was once important to him, family and friends, they considered his life so unvaluable, so unworthy, that they had chained him up in a graveyard waiting for him to just inevitably do what they hoped he would do, which was die. He looked at Jesus like, I don't know who you are, but I want to go with you. Can I go with you? And everything in me wants Jesus to say, yes, of course you can come with me. But that's not what he says. It says in Mark chapter 5, this is in verse 18. As Jesus was getting back into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. But Jesus didn't let him. He said, I want you to go home to your people. Really like the people that just chained me up to the graveyard. I'd like you to go home to your people, tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. I'm sure they were. And then it says that Jesus gets back in the boat, he goes back over that abyss, and then he goes home to Capernaum with his disciples. And the first time my heart fully wrapped itself around that story, I thought, Jesus did all of that abyss crossing for one person. And he wasn't like the mayor of the Decapolis. He wasn't the person that was identified on this strategic report on how best to reach the Decapolis. He wasn't like the captain of the cheerleading squad or the richest person or the highest political ranking officer. He was the number one most unlikely, unwanted, worthless, sent away, put apart, given up on person of that society. And when I hear that, I think that is the Jesus that leaves the 99 to go after the one. And if that's all I knew about him, that would be enough. But we read more about that. If you read one more time, you see that Jesus passes through that region on his way to Jerusalem for Passover, and it says he's met by a crowd of believers. So already there's some first fruit hanging off the tree of this most unlikely missionary who was formerly called Legion. If you go home and Google, which I highly encourage you to do, you'll see there were some plaques that have been discovered dating back to the 1st century of 2 Christian physicians who were martyred for giving their faith, their services to the poor. So 2 people, at least 2 people, so fully grasped the gospel message from Legion's testimony that they gave their life for it. And I think that same Jesus who looked at me that didn't know how to do the traveler's check and saw all the things that were still yet to come, looked as he crossed that abyss and told that storm to be quiet. He knew he was going after Legion, but he also knew he was going to set in place a series of events that would one day impact some people who would receive services that they desperately needed from 2 men who loved him so much they'd give his life for them. And if you go home and Google further, you'll learn in the 4th century, in 400 AD, a man named the Bishop of Decapolis penned something I bet a bunch of you in here know by heart. It's called the Nicene Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only Son, our begotten Lord. And that thing was said yesterday on 7 different continents. And that is all fruit hanging off the tree of the most unlikely missionary that we would see in today, but who Jesus pursued with the heart of one who is not stuck on any given day in the circumstances that we find ourselves in, who is encouraging us to just take the next step, to obey, to listen, to lean into, to trust. Because at the end of the day, who gets the credit in Legion's story is Jesus. At the end of the day, who gets the credit in my story? Jesus. He's the one, he's the star of every show. I wanted to finish with this story of an example of where Jesus likes to come, and when he comes to show, he doesn't like to just show up in any kind of storyline. He likes to come and show off. And this is one of my favorite show-off stories. I was speaking in a setting just like this in Ohio, and this man afterwards came to me, and he's like, hey, are you talking about Monterrey, Mexico? Because I go there sometime on business. Why don't we exchange business cards, and the next time I'm there, I'll take your family out to dinner. He clearly missed my bio. And then we'll go visit some of your orphanages. And I said, that's a great idea. So we exchanged some business cards, but I had a skirt with no pockets, and I immediately lost his business card. I remembered his name was Carlos, but that's all I knew. 4 months later, it was November, and I got a call on a Saturday morning from Carlos. He had kept my business card, and he was in town, and he called to see at the end of the workday if we were free for dinner and to show him around to the orphanages we serve in. And I said, absolutely, Carlos, we'd love to do that. We made arrangements where we could pick him up, and then I hung up the phone, kind of grateful. I never had to confess that I don't really remember anything else about him. And then a couple hours later, he calls me back, and he's like, do you have any pickup trucks? And I said, yeah, I have a pickup truck, absolutely. And he's like, okay, good. When you come, will you pick me up in a pickup truck? And I still was trying to hide the fact that I didn't know what he was talking about. So I'm like, sure, we'll come get you in the pickup truck. That very same day, one of the orphanages we serve, a children's home called Manantial de Amor, the director of that children's home, a man named Edgar, this guy that I love, he woke up that morning and looked in his box of cash, and he realized that for the 50 kids that he serves, he only had enough cash to pay for what we call in Spanish an almuerzo, like a brunch-like meal on that Saturday. He didn't have enough money for any other meals that day, and he didn't have any more food in his orphanage. And at that point, he should have called me. It's like the whole reason I'm there. I would have immediately taken him this emergency kit of beans and rice and eggs and oil and tortilla, this stuff I can buy really cheap but in big quantities, and we would sustain them until we could get them more of what they need. But he was beginning to get afraid that the kids in the orphanage were putting us in a place only God belongs. Jesus is the giver of all good gifts, not Beth and Todd. So he decided instead of calling us to buy the almuerzo and to serve it to the kids. And then 5 hours later, around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, he calls them back into the dining hall for what they all thought would be like supper. But it didn't smell very good. And he looked at them and he said, I don't have anything to feed you tonight. And the kids all looked at him like, that's kind of weird. He's like, but here's the deal. I believe you are children of the King Most High, and that he loves you with a love that you cannot even imagine. So we're going to pray and ask God to deliver us some dinner. And the kids thought that sounded really weird, but they were hungry, so they agreed. And they bowed their heads, and Edgar led them in this prayer about his provision and all that. And just a few minutes into that prayer, one of the little boys, he was 4 years old, his name is Joel, or Joel. He raised his hand, because 4-year-olds don't sit still very well in prayer times, right? He raised his hand. He's like, Tio, 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 which means uncle in Spanish, Tio. Are we praying that God brings us dinner? And he stopped the prayer because that was like the whole point. This is a teachable moment. So he stops the prayer and everybody looks at Joel and Joel's like, are we praying God brings us dinner? And Edgar goes, yes, we are praying that God brings you dinner. And Joel's like, well, what kind of dinner does God bring? And it's like, I don't really know what kind of dinner God's going to bring. Like, kind of, that's the whole point. Let's bow our heads. So they pray for a few more minutes, but Joel's just like, he's just thinking. So he raises his hand. He goes like, two. I think if it's God, I bet he brings us meat. And Edgar's like, okay, we can pray for some meat. So they bow their heads again, but again, once you get a 4-year-old going, he doesn't really ever stop. So they're like praying. Two. What kind of meat do you think God brings us? Because this is a boy who'd had his share of hot dogs in life, and Edgar's like, I have no idea what kind of dinner, what kind of meat God's going to bring us. They bow their heads, and they keep praying. So I have no idea what's going on. Meanwhile, my husband's like, why are we picking up this guy in a pickup truck? I'm like, I don't really know. And he goes, I'm going to go on ahead, find out what's going on before we bring everybody out there. So he goes down to the convention center where Carlos had been working, and he calls me. He's like, do you know what is going on at the convention center today? I'm like, I don't. I'm sorry. And he's like, it's a meat convention. This guy works for a company called John Morrell Meat. Did you not know that? And I was like, I'm sure at one point I knew that, but I forgot the John Morrell Meat Company. He's like, yeah, he's like a meat convention. He keeps asking us if we want any of this. He's got all this stuff out that he's been showing out all day long. He's trying to attract some new restaurant business in our city of 6 million people. So he's got all this stuff he's been using. And he's like, he keeps asking like if we want any of it. And there's all these people around him that are like getting ready to throw stuff away in the dumpster because they can't take it across the border. It's just been sitting out, thawing all day. And he's like, we want this, right? And I was like, yes, we like serve orphans. If it goes, then yes, we want it. Like, yes. And so they start packing all of it up. And he calls me like an hour or two later. And he's like, Beth, I have so much stuff in the back of the pickup truck. I've got like tie-down straps to hold it all in, and we just have like a little deep freezer at home. And he's like, there's no way this stuff is going to fit in the deep freezer, so forget dinner. We're going to just start driving to the orphanages and dropping this stuff off. Will you call ahead and see if anybody's home and like prepare them for the fact we're on our way over with the donation? And I said, absolutely. And there's about 8 homes I was going to call, but the first one on the list is Edgar. He's about 8 blocks from the convention center. So I give a call to Edgar. I'm like, hey, Edgar, this is Beth. I just calling to see like if you're around today. And he's like, yeah, we're here tonight. I'm like, oh, good. Todd's on his way over with somebody. They're going to drop some stuff off. We just want to make sure you're around. He's like, yeah, I'm around. I'm like, okay, good. Well, see you later. He's like, do you know what he's bringing over? I said, no, I don't. I'm not really with them. I don't have any of the details. And he goes, you don't have any of the details? I'm like, well, I know he's at the meat convention, and I know he's bringing over some kind of meat. And he's like, I said, he want me to make sure you had like room in your freezer. Edgar's like, I got room in my freezer. I was like, okay, good. I'm like, okay, well, that's all I really know. And then I'm like thinking to myself, I'm just going to be really honest here. I got 7 more calls to make, so let's get off the call here. And he was like, Beth, before I hung up. He's a great friend of mine. He's like, do you have any idea exactly what kind of meat he's bringing over? And I said, I don't actually have any idea what kind of meat he's going to bring over. And he's like, would you mind terribly finding out? And in my best missionary voice, I said, I would love to do that for you. Give me 1 second. So I hang up the phone with him, and I call Todd. I'm like, baby, when did we get so picky in the orphan business? I don't know if it goes in the freezer, it goes in the mouth, but will you give me the lowdown on exactly what you're bringing over? And he's like, oh my gosh, Beth, you cannot imagine. I don't think they're going to even know how to fix it, but it's this table and boxes and tables full of things like filet mignon and New York strip and T-bone and sirloin. He's like, they're trying to get all this restaurant business, so they're showing their best cuts of meat. He's like, I don't think they're going to know what to do with it, but we're going there for dinner tomorrow night. And I'm like, okay. So I hang up the phone with him. I'm like, Edgar, listen, it's all the right initials you want with your meat. It's like USDA, Choice A, like incredible cuts of things like filet mignon and New York strip and T-bone and sirloin. I'm like, you got room in your freezer for any of that? And at that point, he tells me what had been going on in his home. And then he pulls the phone away from his mouth and he yells out to the kids, hey kids, God's on his way over with your meat. And I love that story for 2 reasons. The first reason I love it is because I think God's got big plans in store for that little boy. That he chose to teach him at age 4. It takes faith the size of a mustard seed to move a mountain. I don't know faith any smaller than the size of a 4-year-old orphan. That's it. That's as small as it gets. And Jesus taught him that lesson and all the rest of us that hear his story. That the whole thing is set up on what he brings to the table and not what we do. that he has promises that he's made since the beginning of time that he cannot not keep. And the second reason I like that story is because I find myself, first of all, I don't like to get my back against the wall. And when I do get my back against the wall, I find that my first inclination is to cry out to man and not to God. And you know what happens when you call out to man? You get things like beans and rice and eggs and oil and tortilla, which feels at first like it fills you up, but the truth is it's pretty cheap. And there's something otherworldly, supernatural, bigger than us that happens when we get ourselves in places and circumstances where we can't fix it, we can't solve it, we don't know enough, we don't have enough, we aren't enough on our own to move the ball down the field. That we need God to come in and show up and show off and do his thing and then get all the glory. And if there's one thing this morning that I could encourage you to do, don't let anyone tell you you have to have it all figured out before you obey God, that you have to be all cleaned up and written out and you have to be smart about it. Now, there's a place and time and a value in us exercising the experiences we have and the gifts we have and getting the counsel of others and accessing the wisdom of those who have gone before us. I'm not discounting those things, but that's not what we stand on. We stand on the fact that Jesus tells us every single day, you have two choices. You either tell me yes or you say no. You either cross the abyss and face that opposition, and then you silence those words. I mean, this Bible, right? Joshua 1:8, it says this, do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth, but meditate on it day and night so that you can be careful to do everything that's written in it. The word meditate in English, we say in Hebrew, is hagah. Hagah, think back to your high school English classes. It's one of those onomatopoeias, those words that sound like what they are, like hiss or like boom or like pop. In Hebrew, that onomatopoeia, hagah, means the sound a lion makes as he consumes his prey. Say hagah with me like a lion would sound a prey. Ready? 1, 2, 3. That verse says, do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Consume it like a lion would its prey. Today, Jesus is not always in the boat telling the storm to go away for us. He instead has given us that word, the words out of his mouth. So when those storms of life, when that opposition comes and threatens to derail you from the calling that God's given you, you have the word out of his mouth to silence the storm and to go and to chase after the one. Let's pray. Jesus, I am so grateful. I am grateful for the way that you are stirring in us a desire to be swept up in stuff bigger than we are, to be able to say, I don't know, I don't have, I can't see, where now, with whom, and where, and when, and to have more questions than answers, but to know confidently inside of us that you are leading us, that you are calling us, that you are walking us down that path of a storyline that's bigger than any story we could have ever written for ourselves. Jesus, call us. Teach us to lean into you, to celebrate when you come and show off. Thank you, Jesus, that the whole thing is all set up on what you have already done and what you are promising and not on anything that I bring to the table. Jesus, all we give to you today is our faithfulness and our availability. Write big storylines through the students at Grand Canyon University. Take them all over the world and demonstrate your glory. And I pray these things in your name. Amen. Amen.